The One Teacher School Museum at Kelvin Grove was established to record something of the history of education in Queensland. It recalls an era when these One Teacher schools were the most common form of schooling for most boys and girls in this state. Clarrie, no doubt the One Teacher School Museum brings back memories of your years in One Teacher schools, both as a pupil and later as a teacher. I believe at the age of 16 you arrived as a teacher in a One Teacher school.
Yes, Peter, I did. I was principal of a school at the age of 16 and a half. I had my first inspection before I was 17. And the museum does bring back many memories. I go inside the room and I see the slates, and that's the first thing I remember, the squeak of the pencils on the slates and the terrible sound when sometimes the slate pencil went too far into the slate pencil holder and there was a great scratch on the slate. I remember the smells, because one thing that's missing from the One Teacher School Museum are the little bottles of water on the desk that you had to take to clean the slates, and the slate rag, which never seemed to be clean from one year's end to another. So slate rag achieved a certain smell of its own, particularly when you consider that many boys, not many girls, they were too gentle and delicate, but many boys used to use spit to clean their slate. And as I say, the smell of the room was fairly distinctive. It's the smell of sweat, the smell of slate rags, the smell of ink. And the room brings back noises as well to me. The scraping back of the forms as you stood up. The crash of the books on the floor as somebody moved, because you're in this desk with 5 or 6 people in, and if one person moved, 10 to 1, your books were going to hit the floor because there was only a very narrow ledge. It also brings back memories of the time I learnt to read the Little Primer, little black book, a cat, a rat, a cat on a mat, the first words that I learned to read. No colour, no nothing, but those were the first words I learned to read in the Little Primer. The inkwells, and the fact that, again, if somebody bumped the desk, 10 to 1, there would be ink over the desk if you were lucky, over your pants if you were unlucky. And then you'd go home and cop it from Mum because you had ink on your pants. But yes, it does bring back many memories.
What was the makeup of One Teacher schools as far as number of children, number of classes in those days?
Well, when I went to school, and that was 1933, it was a fairly big One Teacher school. There would have been 30 and more children there. I would have started to teach at a place called Diefenbach with about 14 children, I think, to start with. You had to have an average attendance of 12 to keep the school open. It would have been about 14, and within the next couple of years, it would have gone up to 21. Every second year, there'd be an intake. 4 grades one year normally, and 5 grades another year. And I think that's probably different from what you had.
Yes, my experience, of course, was a lot later than yours, and by the time I came along, we were encouraged to take children when they turned up at the school. So I think I can remember having 32 children at one stage with 7 classes, different classes to cater for. But the philosophy of education was changing somewhat by that time.
Yes.
What about coming to school, Clarrie? We hear interesting stories of how children used to have to walk distances to school and come by different forms of transport to the way they come today.
Well, that's right, Peter. There were bike riders, always bike riders, but there were also lots of horse riders. And they'd come to school very often, 3 to a horse. They would have no saddle, just 1, 2, 3, one behind another. I can't remember, despite Saltbush Bill's cartoons, I can't remember more than 3 to a horse. But
with such a small number of children, getting them into school must have been a pretty easy exercise. 12, 14 children just wandering in when the bell went?
That's where you're wrong. They did not wander in when the bell went. The bell went, certainly. Everything in the One Teacher school was supposed to be organised exactly as a large school was organised. So that if, for example, in my One Teacher school when I was 16, I had, say, 14 children, I can remember I had 2 children in grade 7, which is the present grade 8. That was the top grade in the primary school. 2 children there, one child in grade 5, and so on. There were more in the smaller grades. But nevertheless, when I lined them up to come in, and I did line them up to come in, I used to stand at the top of the stairs and make sure my voice was authoritative and demanding in the commands I gave. I would ask them to fall in, and they would fall in like soldiers. They always had to be in straight lines. The two boys had to be in a straight line of their own. The one girl had to be in a straight line of her own. And they were ranged each side of the bottom of the steps, and then you would turn them to come into school, and they would march in time. It all had to be done and in a very orderly fashion, and that applied even when I went to school, despite the fact the first teacher I had was a bit sloppy. He wasn't as efficient as the others, but that's the way it ought to have been done, and that was when you lined up and you looked at fingernails and you looked at teeth and you made sure people had a handkerchief or a nose rag, as we sometimes used to call them in those days.
This sense of order, then, it sounds as though it continued on through the school day.
Indeed it did. You got into school and everything you did was done in an orderly fashion. When you read the correct way. You read out aloud. You stood. You never, and the word I use is never, sat down to read. Most of the time the whole class would be standing up for the half hour of reading. Some of them, I can remember once, for example, I got a bit faint and keeled over like a good old soldier. And the teacher had to take me downstairs and run water over my wrists to bring me back. Nevertheless, you stood up and you stood at attention while the reading went on. You held the book in a certain way. You read in a certain way. And if you didn't do it that way, you were marked down. In fact, you might get a clip under the ear, or you might get a little bit of stick if you weren't doing it the right way. But there was a right way to do everything. When you wrote, you tilted the slate at an angle of from 30 to 45 degrees to your right. There were no left-handers. You were not allowed to be a left-hander.
What happened to left-handers?
They were changed to right-hand. For example, my wife is a left-hander, but she writes right-handed, as she ought to. That's the way to do it. And you tilted the slate to the right, and you wrote with a slate pencil with your feet on the floor and holding the slate pencil in a certain way. Later on, when you graduated to ink and paper, you did it exactly the same way, but there was an orderly way and a correct way to do everything.
The rote learning seemed to have played an important part in children's schooling experiences in the past. Can you have any memories of rote learning experiences?
Indeed I can. That was, as you say, the way we did learn. We learnt by rote, and if we could parrot back what we'd learnt, whether we understood it or not, we got the full marks. For example, I can distinctly remember in grade 4 where the teacher had a chart, and I can remember it was a history chart, and at the top of it he had the words Anglo-Saxon institutions. I had no idea what institutions meant. It then went on to talk about the folkmoot and the witan. I didn't know what the folkmoot was. I didn't know what the witan was. But he had all this down on a chart, and part of our learning in history was to go out and read this chart, which we did. Come the end of the month, because we were examined every month, come to the end of the month, his history exam was, write what you know about Anglo-Saxon institutions. So I wrote everything he had on his chart about Anglo-Saxon institutions, and he had to give me 15 out of 15, even though I didn't know what it was all about. And yes, rote learning, wherever you went, there was rote. There was drill and rote learning in tables. 2 1s are 2, 2 2s are 4 was chanted out again and again. And in fact, there was a lot of noise in the school. And that was not bad. You would have perhaps children out on the veranda reading aloud. So long as the teacher could hear them, he was fairly safe. He knew they were reading correctly. There was out on the other veranda, you might have children chanting tables. He might have the little class with him saying things like, A like an apple on a branch, A says ah, B like a bat and ball, B says buh. And this would be going on, quite a lot of noise. It was only the disorganized noise that the teacher was worried about. And in fact, everybody was worried about it. And perhaps I could tell you a little story here about a lack of order. I've told you that my first teacher was perhaps not as efficient as he ought to have been. He was what was called, I think, a sloppy teacher, a bad teacher. He was a very kind fellow, I can remember. But I began school in a one-teacher school with windows 3 parts of the way round and the front wall blank. It was for the blackboards and so on, no windows. It was low to the ground. And whenever the teacher said, "You may go," the whole school, this is show you how inefficient he was, the whole school would just, or he'd say, "Stand," and "You may go." You'd stand, and "You may go," you'd go out the window. That was the easiest and quickest way to get out of the school, out the window. Back windows, side windows, and so on. Came the inspector. And in fact, all the other children, this was my first year at school, all the other children, despite the fact we didn't know the inspector was coming, had had an inspection before. We had not. And I can remember 5 of us sitting there in the on the left-hand side of the class in front of the blackboard, 5 little kids, scared to death of the inspector because we were, the stranger in the room obviously was out to get somebody, and it was probably us. So luckily, around about 11 o'clock, or 10 to 11 it would be, the teacher said, "Stand." We knew what was coming next. We didn't know any better. And while everybody else in the school stood correctly and at order as was expected, we went out the window. And in fact, we could hear, all the school could hear, up the end of the playground where we congregated, the inspector roaring at the poor teacher. So that was one time when order wasn't the order of the day. And I'm sorry to say that I caused it. One of us caused it.
What was discipline like, Clarrie?
Discipline was fairly strict. I can remember, for example, the second teacher we got after that first teacher. Now, we were quite ignorant country kids. We were polite kids. We certainly were not rude kids. However, we used to call the teacher, that first teacher. That wasn't what you were supposed to do. We didn't know any better. And the new teacher came along and he drove a car into the school grounds. A cousin of mine opened the gate to let him in. That was a very kind act on my cousin's part. He saw him coming in the car.
This was his first day, wasn't it?
His first day at the school. My cousin said, "Here comes the new teacher," and ran to the gate to open. Now, that was a kind act, a kind country act, because to open the gate for somebody was good.
And to close it again.
And to close it again afterwards, to make sure if the horses got out the horse paddock, they wouldn't get out on the road. That's right. And also that no cattle or horses on the road got into the school ground. So he closed it, but as the teacher came in, he gave him a wave, a friendly wave. And I can remember the first parade we had with that teacher, where he roared at the whole school for rudeness. The fact that the boys did not take their hats off. The fact that we didn't call him sir, we soon learned. And all day he went around with his cane on the back of his neck. And we were scared to death, I can tell you. That he used that cane too. And not on me because I was a good fellow, but he used it.
Sure.
And yes, certainly from that experience, I'd say discipline was extremely severe in the one-teacher school. It was the cane. People got used to it. You weren't all that living in fright all the time. You get used to anything, you know, but it was fairly severe. We were threatened with the reformatory too.
The 3 R's, from what you've been saying, sounds as though they played almost the major part of the curriculum.
Well, yes, they did. Even, I'd say, after my one-teacher school days, even up to the time when, in the 1960s, that would have been true. And that was well after my one-teacher school days. But despite this fact, there were other things taken. There was music taken, but that was singing. You sang. There was art taken, but only to the extent that you modelled the master. For example, our art lessons were drawing objects. I can remember we drew things like apples. Oh, they were tremendously interesting. They used to thrill us. Only pastel drawing, and your hands would get all dirty with pastels, and hopefully the teacher would let you out afterwards to wash them before you got back on your slates or somewhere else, or got them on your clothes and get into trouble when you get home for having pastel on your clothes. But they were a filthy thing to use. I still don't like using pastels. But you modelled what was done. There was no creativity. The apple was drawn by the teacher on the board. You drew it exactly the same as he did. And if he was silly enough to give you a mark for it, it was how close you were to his drawing that you got a mark for. You'd draw a bottle, but he'd draw the bottle first, put in the highlights, and you would do the same. And different classes were supposed to be drawing different things. So yes, the arts were taken. Music was taken. They were good school songs we used to sing. I can remember Swinging, Swinging and stuff like that, or The Old School Days, I think was another song we sang. But we learned poetry. But again, you had to say that we learned to recite. We were drilled in poetry. We had to say the poetry in exactly the same way as the teacher said it. And the mark we got for recitation depended upon how closely we modelled the teacher's rendition of the poem. There was no room for your rendition. In fact, we knew, and this is an important lesson we learned, we knew all the time that there was a right way to do things and there was a wrong way to do things. And if the teacher... It never occurred to me, for example, that my way of doing things may be, in fact, better for me than the teacher's way of doing things. Never occurred to me. I knew the teacher was right, and I modelled him in all things. But certainly you were right, the 3 R's were extremely important. You had to be able to read, you had to be able to write, and you had to be able to do sums. And if you could do those things, you were fairly safe.
You've referred to your experience as a schoolboy with the school inspector. Inspectors played an important part in the lives of teachers in those schools too, didn't they?
Oh, indeed they did. As I pointed out, the one teacher, who was white by the time we got back, by the way, from that morning tea time, after the inspector had brought him out, yes, he was obviously extremely scared. We knew as kids that he was extremely scared, and that's one of the things that scared the kids. Yeah, teachers were affected by inspection. I can remember my inspections, for example, when I was teaching in the one-teacher school, that you did not know when the inspector was coming, which is quite different from nowadays, where they let you know, I'll be along, Mr. Meadmore, at such and such a time, and I'll see you. And you're quite prepared. You've got everything up to the knocker. The idea in those days was you catch the teacher. You didn't trust the teacher. You knew that the teacher in the bush was going to loaf anyhow, so you tried to catch him.
That was the assumption.
That must have been the assumption, because under no circumstances would you let the teacher know when you were coming. We did have a bush telegraph, so that if you were lucky enough not to be the first that the inspector saw in the district, somebody might ring you up and say, hey, the beak's here, and you would know very well that maybe your turn was coming up because he's in the district. If he missed you out, you were disappointed because you could get prepared for him. But certainly the inspectors were out to catch you. I can remember at one of my one-teacher schools, for example, being absolutely petrified to hear the kids say, hey, sir, the inspector's outside, when I had 2 kids outside in front having a fight. Continuing one they'd had out in the playground, I'd said, come inside, we'll put the gloves on. You boys do it properly in here. And they were going hammer and tongs, and suddenly somebody saw the inspector coming. You've never seen a school get so fast onto legitimate work as that school did. There was another little experience you might like to hear regarding my first inspection. I tried hard, as all young teachers do. I was very idealistic, and I tried very hard with all aspects of the curriculum in my first school. Came the inspection time. Mr. Morehouse was his name, Ernie Morehouse. And Mr. Morehouse showed me how weak I was by testing every child on most of the subjects and finding weaknesses, which I knew were there anyhow, finding weaknesses which he was only too willing to point out to me. However, there was no way that Mr. Morehouse could see that I had not done everything. At least I'd tackled everything, and I was pretty pleased with myself about that. Came the afternoon, and he said, Mr. Diefenbach, I want to hear you singing. Now, I must tell you that I had a very strange school at Diefenbach. Not one child could sing in tune. They were all tone deaf, with the exception of 2 children from the Roberts family. And these 2 children sang sharp. The rest didn't sing at all. They just mouthed the words in time in a monotone. Now, I was therefore a bit perturbed. I was hoping he wasn't going to ask for my singing, so I said to him, Mr. Morehouse, I've tried very hard in singing. Ah, you could see the suspicious look come on his face. I've got him at last. Here's one thing he hasn't done, and he said with very thin lips, Mr. Diefenbach, I nevertheless want to hear your singing. So I thought, well, it's on his own head. And I said, right, boys and girls, we'll sing the British Grenadiers, which was a very stirring song. And then Mr. Morehouse sat down in the back of the room, and he was treated to their rendition of the British Grenadiers. I sang in tune. I sang very loudly to drown them out. Mr. Morehouse sat there getting redder and redder. while the kids sang, "Some talk of Alexander, and some of Hercules, of Hector," and so on, all through the song. And the further they went, the redder he got. And eventually he could stand it no longer. He went outside. And I took them for another song, I forget which one. And eventually he came back in, wiping tears from his eyes, and said, "That will do, Mr. Diefenbach." But he hadn't caught me out. But yes, they wanted to catch you out, and you were scared of the inspector. Another inspection I had, Peter, was by a Mr. Baker. And he found, I'd been in the school by then over 2 years. I was getting a bit long in the tooth. And I had worked very hard, and he was astounded at the sort of work that my kids were giving him, particularly the lower grades. So much so that when he got to Beenleigh, he said to the infant mistress there, "If you want to find out how to take infants, go out to your Parabar." Oh boy, when I heard that, I thought, what a beautiful thing my report is going to be this time. But no, I was too young. I got the same old report, 6.5, 7, 6.5. Now, despite the fact that I'd been used as an example to a bigger school. So yeah, the inspectors were somebody to be dreaded and somebody to be treated with suspicion as somebody you didn't look forward to seeing, really.
It seems that experiences in the schools there were a lot of differences, and there were some similarities between what existed then and what exists now.
Yes, I think so.